In Britain's criminal history, there are only a few stories that send a chill down the spine, quite like the torture and murder of Brian Waters. This crime, committed over a £20,000 drug debt, has come to be known as one of the most ruthless acts in the underworld and involved an extraordinary cast of characters. A middle-aged father-turned-cannabis farmer, a seasoned Gangland boss, and two men who pretended to be journalists but played roles far darker than any documentary could portray. Brian Waters was born in 1959. He spent most of his adult life working with his hands in construction. He was known by friends and neighbors as a man who could fix almost anything, a man who would stop to help a stranger and who wanted nothing more than to provide for his family. He married Julie, and together they raised two children, Gavin and Natalie. For years he worked on building sites, earning an honest living, but a serious injury on the job damaged his back and left him unable to continue the heavy labor that had supported them. The compensation was insufficient, the bills kept coming, and the stress of supporting a family on little income began to mount. By the mid-1990s, Brian felt trapped. Cheshire is a county of contrasts, its wealthy enclaves sitting alongside pockets of rural hardship. The village of Knutsford, with its rolling green fields and market streets, is also close to the M6 motorway, a route that criminals have long used to move drugs between northern ports and southern cities. Cannabis was growing in popularity and demand was high. Brian heard that many small growers were making more in a week than he could earn in a month in construction. Some were fathers like him who had decided the risk was worth the potential reward. In a moment of desperation, he decided to enter the cannabis trade. At first, Brian only supplied small amounts to people he knew. Soon he saw that the real money lay in importing larger quantities from the Netherlands, where production was more advanced and prices were lower. He set up a small plot there and traveled frequently, ferrying cannabis back to Britain. By 1998, he had developed a network of contacts and was making a modest living. He was careful, but he knew the risks: the law, rival criminals, and the threat of being caught at the border. Despite the danger, he justified his actions by telling himself that he was only dealing in a soft drug and that he needed the money. He managed to keep his criminal activities from his children, and to their friends, he remained the same helpful father. His trips to the Netherlands brought him into contact with a different class of criminal. One of these was John Wilson, a 54-year-old crime boss based in the small town of Glossop in Derbyshire. Wilson had a reputation for being ruthless and organized. He was involved in various illegal enterprises, including the supply of drugs, and he enforced debts with violence. When he first met Brian, he saw an opportunity. Brian could transport cannabis for him, and he could take a cut for each successful run. It seemed like a simple arrangement. Wilson would supply the product, and Brian would use his Dutch connections to ferry it to Britain. For a while it worked, and they made money together. But in the underworld, trust is always fragile. One wrong move can turn a partner into a target. Then came the summer of 2002, and that one wrong move happened. He was caught. Brian was stopped by customs officers on his trip from the Netherlands and found with £20,000 in cash. He could not explain where the money came from, and it was confiscated. The cash belonged to Wilson, and Brian had no way to return it. He hoped that his years of service and friendship would buy him leniency, but he misjudged Wilson's temperament. Wilson saw the loss as a personal insult, a sign that Brian had mismanaged the job, or worse, tried to cheat him. He demanded repayment and threatened consequences if Brian did not comply. Brian avoided him, perhaps hoping the problem would fade. Instead, Wilson's anger simmered and then boiled over. In the underworld, a debt unpaid can quickly become a death sentence. Wilson decided to make an example of Brian. To do so, he needed to know exactly where Brian was growing his cannabis in Britain. Brian had rented a place called Burnt House Farm near Tabley, not far from Junction 19 on the M6, to cultivate his own crop. The farm was secluded, with outbuildings and barns that could be used to hide plants and equipment. Brian tried to keep the location secret, telling only a few trusted people. But Wilson was determined. He turned to two men who had skills in surveillance and infiltration: Christopher Guest Moore Jr. and his cousin James Raven. Moore and Raven were an unusual pair. In their early 20s, they had worked as freelance researchers for television documentaries on the BBC and Channel 4. In that role, they had learned how to gain access to criminal circles by posing as trusted associates. They had participated in investigations that exposed racism in police training and football hooligan groups, capturing hidden footage with secret cameras. In these projects, they earned good money and gained a taste for the thrill of undercover work. Yet they were also drawn to the criminal underworld and were willing to bend rules to get the footage they needed. Rumors went around that they sometimes crossed lines, staging scenes or collaborating with criminals to create drama. And those said rumors would later take on a dark significance. Christopher's background further complicated matters. His father, also named Christopher Guest Moore, and nicknamed the ultimate hacker by London lawyers and journalists, ran a private investigation business. He was renowned for using creative and occasionally illegal methods to gather information. He taught his son how to manipulate documents, how to tail people without being noticed, and how to use false identities. His reputation was so formidable that he was feared in legal circles. Yet his willingness to bend rules extended to his family. When his son would have to lay low, the elder Moore provided him with clothes and cash, and later served a short prison sentence for those actions. This connection suggests that for the younger Moore, deception and evasion were not just professional tools, but part of his family culture. Wilson approached Moore and Raven with a proposition. He needed someone to find Brian Waters' hidden farm. The two men saw a chance to earn a large sum. They agreed to surveil Brian and identify his cannabis plot. In June 2003, they began following Brian's family. One morning, they parked near the Waters family home in Mannering Close in Nantwich. When Brian's son Gavin left his car, they tailed him. Gavin drove through the countryside, past hedgerows and fields, and eventually turned onto a track leading to Burnt House Farm. The watchers took note of the route, the layout of the property, and the buildings where cannabis might be stored. They returned several times, studying comings and goings and learning the schedule of workers. Moore used his skills to avoid detection. He had worked as a camera operator and knew how to remain invisible while filming. He observed that Brian's son and his partner's stepson, a 19-year-old named Suleiman Razak, tended the plants during the day. He passed all this information to Wilson. With knowledge of the farm, Wilson planned the attack. He assembled a team that included James Raven and Otis Matthews, both known for their willingness to use violence, and at least 3 other men. They also included Moore himself. The gang met at Moore's house on Burford Lane in Lymm in the early hours of June 19, 2003. The plan was to steal any harvestable cannabis and equipment and capture Brian and force him to repay the debt. To transport the stolen goods, they had brought a horse box and parked it on the farm. Early that morning, before anyone arrived, they stripped dried cannabis from the barns, loaded it into the horse box, and returned to the farm to lay in wait. They trashed fixtures and fittings inside the farmhouse, creating devastation that the sentencing judge later called wanton destruction. The scene was set for an ambush. The first person to arrive at the farm that day was Suleiman Razak. Razak worked with Brian and Gavin to water and harvest the cannabis plants. He had no idea that a team of masked men was waiting for him. As soon as he entered, he was seized, tied by his ankles and hoisted upside down. He was lowered headfirst into a butt of dirty water and felt himself drowning. When he was pulled out, he was beaten with canes and subjected to electric shocks. His assailants poured phosphoric acid, a chemical used in cannabis cultivation, onto his back burning his skin. They used a staple gun to shoot metal staples into his flesh. They taped him to a chair and continued beating him, demanding to know where the money was. Razak later told police that he was terrified, confused, and convinced that he would die. He counted 6 attackers but could not see their faces because they wore balaclavas. He didn't know whether Brian or Gavin would come and save him, or whether anyone would even know he was missing. About an hour later, Brian himself arrived at the farm in his pickup truck. He noticed the unusual horse box near the entrance. Suspicion crossed his mind, but before he could act, he was grabbed by the waiting men. They dragged him to the same cowshed where Razak had been tortured. Brian, a strong man who had worked hard all his life, now faced a gauntlet of cruelty. Everything they did to Razak, they did it to Brian as well, only 10 times worse. He was tied by his ankles, hoisted upside down, and plunged into the water butt repeatedly, each time emerging gasping and coughing. He was beaten with metal bars and garden canes, leaving bruises and broken ribs. His captors poured caustic chemicals over him and used a staple gun on him. In a particularly brutal act, an iron bar was forced into his body. Throughout this ordeal, his attackers demanded that he produce the £20,000 owed. Brian could not supply money he did not have. He begged for mercy, pleading that he could not breathe, but his pleas were ignored. After more than 3 hours of torture, he died from the cumulative injuries. A subsequent post-mortem revealed 123 external injuries, bruises, lacerations, incised wounds, a collapsed lung, and fractured ribs. The pathologist noted that the attack involved sadism and gratuitous violence. Meanwhile, 2 of the attackers took Brian's car and drove to his family home in Nantwich. They barged straight in and grabbed Brian's wife, Julie. She was frightened and confused, with no idea where her husband was or why these men had come. They ransacked the house looking for money and valuables, but found nothing. They then forced Julie into a vehicle and drove her back to the farm, effectively abducting her. The mother of 2 was now taken into the heart of the nightmare. Around this time, Gavin and his sister Natalie, who had celebrated her 21st birthday the previous day, arrived at the farm. Gavin was punched, kicked, and choked with a rope. Natalie had a gun thrust into her mouth and was threatened with sexual assault. Both siblings saw their father bound, bleeding, and unconscious. They pleaded with the attackers to call an ambulance, telling them that their father had a lung condition and could not breathe, but they were ignored. When Brian finally stopped moving, his assailants dragged his body across the yard and dumped it in the adjacent milking parlor like a bag of rubbish. The gang had hoped to leave quickly with their loot, but panic crept in. David Moran, who had been acting as a lookout and had driven the horse box, decided to call the police from a phone box near the motorway.
Right. Newport connecting, payphone 01565 722 252.
Thank you. How I play?
Oh, hi. I've just come off the M6 from Manchester Airport. I'm not sure the jump to the bases.
Yeah.
Going towards Northwich, is it the A556?
Yes.
I've got up there, and the first farm on the right-hand side. It's about 500 yards. It looked like there was 3 men beating somebody up in the courtyard.
All right.
Did it look there?
So if you come up with junction 18 and take the 556, yeah?
Yeah, I think it's 18. It's
19, that right, yeah.
19, yeah. 556.
Yeah.
About 500 yards on the right,
yeah.
Going towards Northwich,
yeah.
In a farmyard. Like, and that looked like there's 3 gentlemen, not 3 men. Looking at a man.
How long ago was that?
About 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah. So what's your name, please?
I'd rather not get involved, you know.
No, fair enough. Okay, I'll look into it for you.
Thank you very much.
Perhaps he felt guilt, or perhaps he wanted to ensure that he would be seen as a concerned passerby of court. He told the operator he had seen 3 men beating someone at a farm. He gave the approximate location and then hung up. This call brought officers to the scene faster than the gang anticipated. When police cars with flashing blue could have been heard in the distance, the attackers scattered. They started running and fleeing across the farm fields, abandoning the horse box and leaving behind a scene of horror. James Raven was caught nearby, wearing a high-visibility jacket that made him easy to identify. The others vanished into the countryside. Investigators found cigarette ends, drinks bottles, gloves, hat, and even a bag of feces at the scene. These items carried DNA that would later link Christopher Guest Moore and others to the crime. But for the moment, the priority was rescuing the rest of the family and securing the crime scene. This particular act and the very murder of Brian Waters shocked the locals and everyone around. The brutality of the attack was especially shocking, and the involvement of masked men made headlines across Britain. The farm became a symbol of cruelty. Neighbors and friends described Brian as a helpful and caring man. They struggled to reconcile the horrific scene described in newspapers with the person they had known. Meanwhile, police officers launched a complex investigation to find and apprehend all those involved. Within months, they arrested John Wilson, James Raven, and Otis Matthews. Each was charged with murder and conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm. Their trials took place in 2004 and 2006 at Chester Crown Court. The cases were challenging because some of the attackers were still missing, and those who were present denied their involvement. During the trials, the evidence presented by the prosecution painted Wilson as the mastermind. He had ordered the attack as retribution for the unpaid debt and assembled the team. James Raven, identified by witnesses and by his high-visibility jacket, was described as playing a prominent role in the physical assault. Otis Matthews was portrayed as Wilson's right-hand man, helping to organize the ambush. All three men were convicted. The judge sentenced each of them to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years. The court observed that although Wilson did not personally wield the weapons that killed Brian, he bore full responsibility for orchestrating the violence. Raven and Matthews were likewise held accountable for their roles. These convictions brought some measure of justice to the Waters family, but they did not end the case. One key figure remained at large: Christopher Guest Moore Jr. Moore's disappearance posed a significant challenge. 2 days after the murder, he used a false passport under the name Andrew Christopher Lamb to fly to Spain. This passport had been cloned from the identity of a real person living in a long-term care home in Britain. Over the next several years, he traveled across Europe and Africa using multiple aliases. He visited South America, Mozambique, and Turkey, blending in with tourists and expatriates. Eventually, he settled in Malta, where he used his knowledge of the sea to become a yacht charter captain and businessman. He lived under the radar, running a luxury lifestyle business and socializing with wealthy clients. He knew how to avoid detection. He kept a low profile, avoided official records, and used his charm to deflect questions. He built a new life, making friends and connections in the yachting community. For the Waters family, however, his absence was a constant reminder that justice had not been fully served. They lived in fear, unsure if or when he might be caught, and remained haunted by the fact that one of the men responsible for Brian's death walked free. International pressure to capture Moore grew over the years. He was placed on Europe's most wanted list, and police forces across the continent were alerted. In 2019, new intelligence suggested that he was living under an assumed name in Malta. Maltese police, working with British authorities, conducted surveillance on a man known locally as Andrew Lamb. Then, on a sunny day in June 2019, they raided the marina where he kept his yacht. Moore did not resist arrest. He was taken into custody and identified through fingerprints. British authorities requested his extradition, and after legal proceedings, he was returned to the United Kingdom in March 2020.
Extradition proceedings are underway after one of Britain's most wanted fugitives was detained in Malta over a brutal killing 16 years ago. Christopher Guest-Moore had been on the run ever since the death of Brian Waters at his family home in Cheshire. The 41-year-old was arrested on Thursday night and is due to appear in court again tomorrow.
He insisted that he was innocent and claimed that he had left the farm before any violence had occurred. He said he had gone to steal cannabis equipment for a documentary, and that when he realized Wilson had discovered he was working undercover, he abandoned the plan. These assertions contradicted the evidence, but they formed the basis of his defense. Moore's trial took place in late 2021, after an earlier jury failed to reach a verdict. The prosecution outlined the role he played in locating the farm, planning the attack, and participating in the violence. Witnesses described how he had tailed Gavin to the farm and had attended planning meetings. DNA evidence linked him to gloves and other items found at the scene. The jury deliberated for more than 12 hours before reaching a majority verdict. They found Moore guilty of murder and conspiracy to cause grievous bodily harm. On the 10th of December 2021, Sir Peter Openshaw sentenced him to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 24 years, bringing his punishment in line with Wilson, Raven, and Matthews. The judge noted that while Moore may not have intended to kill Brian, he had engaged in a carefully planned and sadistic assault that culminated in death. The sentencing guidelines required a mandatory life sentence. He also observed that Moore's 16 years on the run aggravated his crime by denying justice to the victim's family for so long. The verdict provided closure to the Waters family, who had waited nearly 2 decades for all those responsible to be held accountable. The family of Brian Waters say they never gave up hope after the final member of the gang that tortured and murdered him was found guilty nearly 2 decades later. Waters, a cannabis grower, was beaten and suspended upside down at Burnt House Farm in Tabley, Cheshire in June 2003 over a drug debt. That week, Christopher Guest-Moore Jr., a former TV researcher who spent 16 years on the run before being arrested in Malta, was convicted of Waters' murder at Chester Crown Court, becoming the last of 4 men to face prison for the killing. In a statement, Waters' family thanked Cheshire Constabulary, prosecutors, and family liaison officers for their years of work. They described the lasting trauma of the attack, saying the pain and flashbacks had never left them, and that fear and isolation shaped their lives for more than 18 years. The verdict, they said, brings a painful chapter to an end, and they asked for privacy as they tried to move forward. Every great crime story ends with a question, not about guilt or innocence, but about how people reach the point where humanity is abandoned completely. The murder of Brian Waters wasn't just another brutal entry in Britain's underworld archives. It was a window into how ordinary lives can be pulled into extraordinary darkness, how desperation and greed can collide, and how justice, though slow, still finds its way through the cracks of time. For nearly 2 decades, the Waters family lived under a shadow that refused to lift. They endured trauma that no verdict could erase, clinging to the small victories that came when each man responsible was finally held to account. Their pain became a symbol of endurance, a quiet reminder that behind every headline and courtroom sentence, there are people who must learn to keep living in the aftermath. Theirs is a story of survival, not in body, but in spirit. The Burnt House Farm case also left a scar on the public conscience. It blurred the line between journalist and criminal, exposing how curiosity without morality can become complicity. It forced society to look at the uneasy marriage between media, money, and crime. How far people will go for access, recognition, or control. And it showed that the victims of these choices are never the ones who sought the spotlight. In the end, Brian Waters' name will not be remembered for the world he entered, but for the lesson his story carries. That evil often wears familiar faces. That justice, though delayed, can still rise. And that every act of cruelty reveals something deeper about what we value as a society. The tragedy at Burnt House Farm will forever echo as one of Britain's darkest warnings. What are your thoughts on this? Let us know in the comments down below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Catch you in the next one.